students, welcome back. This is Torres, elbow bump. How are you? Are you doing okay? How's your family? Are they okay? Remember, if you need anything, please make sure you send me an email, contact me through Starfish so that I can try to help in some way. So lucky you, you get to hear my voice for another lecture, but the best part is we're going to be learning how to evaluate the shape of a distribution. Yay! In the last video, we went in depth into discussing histograms. And so I just want to do a quick little review of histograms. So histogram is a type of bar graph. There are no spaces between the actual bars. Notice that this is completely flush with the next bar. Let me grab my pointer. Notice that this bar right here is completely up against the next bar, is completely up against the next bar, and so on. This is because we want to show that there's a continuation and there's no break between the numbers, that they just go continuously until the next one. The horizontal axis is numerical, and in a frequency histogram, the vertical axis shows the frequency, how often something appears. We can gather the data into groups called bins. They can also be called intervals or classes, and the width of that bin is important in the shape of the distribution. Frequency histograms are really nice because we can just easily visualize the distribution. Remember that the tallest bar is the mode. It's the most frequent value. So here we can tell that there are a lot more values between 9 all the way up to 12 than there are between 0 all the way up to 3. So here are a couple histograms. They both display the same data. On the left, we have the histogram of tip amounts, where we have a bin width of, it appears to be about a bin width of 2. On the other side, and let me grab my pointer again, on the other side we have, again, a histogram of tip amounts, but this time the bin width seems to be about 5. Notice that we still have the tips, right, that are being put into bins, tip amounts, that are being put into bins here on the x-axis, and the y-axis is showing the frequency. So here it appears that this might be between 14 all the way up to 16 is what this bin would be right here. It's saying that there were 10 instances where there was a tip between 14 all the way up to 16. Here the information is just compiled in a wider bin. So the same information is showing here, but it has been distributed into the wider bins. Part of that information is going to go into this bin because this is where 14 would go, because this is going to go from 10 all the way up to 15. And the information about 15 is going to go into this bin because in addition to whatever was in 16. So it's showing the same amount. The smaller width does show more detail, but if you have too much detail, you're not really going to be able to display the main features. So in this class, I really just tell you what size bin you should use so you don't have to play around with it too much. But the big idea, which we discussed in the last video, was really that the bin width can influence what the shape looks like. Now, just a quick review of relative frequency histograms. Relative frequency histograms they look just like the frequency histograms in that on the x-axis you're still going to get numbers on the x-axis that describe the bins, the bin width. On the y-axis you're not going to have numbers any longer. You're going to have percentages, or you're going to have proportions. Another way to say that is relative frequency. And we did that in the last video when we computed the relative frequency by basically taking the frequency and dividing it by the entire sample size. So we were getting percents along the y-axis instead of just frequencies. The relative frequency histogram and the frequency histogram look the same. The only difference is that the scale on the y-axis has changed. So here we have a relative frequency histogram. Notice that instead of numbers in here, right, we have relative frequencies. We have proportions. If we were to multiply these by 100, we would, instead of getting 0.1, we would get 10%. Instead of getting 0.2, we would get 20%, and so on. So that's the only difference, is instead of just the raw numbers, we're actually making this relative. 50% of women score an average of between 0.7 all the way up to 0.8, not including 0.8 goals. This also shows that there's very, very few amount of exceptional players, right? Only about maybe 5, if it's 5, maybe even less than that, 5% of women soccer players score almost 1.5 goals per game. Again, it's still showing that the tallest here is the mode. It's showing the most frequent value, the thing that you see most often, what is expected. And right in this example, we're seeing that it is expected that. So this shows that approximately 50% of professional women soccer players score between 0.7 all the way up to 0.8, but not including 0.8 goals per game. And there is a very small amount of exceptional players, probably less than 5%, which score 1.4 goals per game on average. So when do you use each one? Honestly, I'm not sure that it necessarily matters for the purposes of this class, because the shape will ultimately be the same. However, if you wanted to show how many instances occurred within a certain bin, then you want to use a frequency histogram. If you want to show the proportion or the percent of values that exist within a given bin, then you're going to use a relative frequency histogram. So what we talked about in earlier this unit, when we talked about the different kind of charts, you want to select the chart or the figure that best describes the data, best displays the data in a visual way that will make sense to the reader. Our goal for looking at the distribution of the data in terms of a histogram is that the histogram allows us to interpret things like frequencies, so we can tell by how tall the histogram is, or a particular bar of the histogram is, on how often we would see a value or a range of values. What is the most common value or range of values? Is the data symmetrical? Are there values that are very different than where you would see most of the data? And so we can get a very good indication by looking at a histogram exactly what's happening with the overall data, with all of the data together. When we look at the aspects of the distribution, we want to look at 3 things. We want to look at the shape, and that's looking at how symmetrical it is, how many modes we have, any other distinguishing features like outliers and things. We want to know what the typical value is. We want to know what value is in the center, what the median would be. And in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the spread of the data, how close the data is or how spread out is the data. So let's look at symmetric distributions. So remember, the word symmetric means that it's the same on both sides. In this case, the left side is a mirror image of the right side. If we look at this shape of the data right here, then you can see that this side of the data is approximately the same as this side of the data, right? If this is a mirror, it would be reflecting the same on both sides. The same is happening here. You have the same on the left as you do on the right. And approximately the same is happening here. It's not exact, but it's pretty close, where you have everything kind of pretty much the same. There's the same, and this is a frequency distribution. See how it says frequency? They're all frequency distributions, right? So approximately all of these bins have approximately 150 values within them, okay? All of these are symmetrical. One thing that can influence the symmetric nature of your data distribution is an outlier. An outlier is a data value that is either much greater or much smaller than the rest of your data. So it's very, very different than the expected mode. There's lots of reasons that you can have outliers in your data. Sometimes they can just be an error in data collection, like you just accidentally transposed something incorrectly as it was collected. If there's no error, it could be that that particular case does not adequately reflect your population of interest. It doesn't mean that that's automatically happening. I'm saying that that's something that you can look into. Does that person actually reflect the population of interest? For example, if I want to look to see how much employees are earning and I accidentally get into the data what the owner's salary is, their salary is probably much greater than the rest of the employees that they're paying at a lower wage. They don't fit the question. They're a different person. They're a different case that shouldn't be within this data. What do I mean by effect on the distribution? Well, let's just start with this. Our goal in our distribution is to have what they call the normal distribution, which is a histogram that would have an overall look of sort of like a curve. So if you can imagine the little bars going through here, the mode would be sort of in the center. You're looking at one mode, one hump, and the data is symmetrical. It's the same on both sides. When we have a normal distribution, we can use this distribution to make a lot of inferences about the population because the normal distribution works on theories of probability. When you have an outlier, however, what it does is it starts to skew the data. Okay, so instead of having a normal distribution where the center would have the majority of the data, and let me get my pointer again, instead of having a distribution where it would be kind of like this, and I hope you can kind of imagine where I would have data that was, the mode was in the center, right, and then it became symmetrical so that it came out into two tails on the sides. Instead of that, I'm going to get either an outlier that's going to pull my data to the right, right? This right here is an outlier. It's going to pull my data to the right. Or the opposite can happen where I have an outlier that is a lot less than the majority of my data, and it's going to pull my data to the left. So again, there's an outlier out here. What it's doing is it's creating a tail off to the right that is longer than anything that exists over here. Thus, it's not symmetrical. Since the outlier is to the right, we would call this a right skew. It's pulling it to the right. Another way to describe this is positively skewed. And if you can think of positive numbers become more positive as they go to the right, that's where this is positively skewed. The opposite is true for negatively skewed. If you have an outlier out here that is much less than the majority of your data, here's your mode. So this outlier is much less. It's pulling the distribution to the left. So an outlier to the left pulls the distribution to the left. And numbers become more negative as they go to the left. So this can also be called negatively skewed. So if you were looking at this, you would say that this distribution is not symmetrical. It does have one mode. There's just one mode here. And it is positively skewed. Same thing is happening here. This is a unimodal curve. It has a negative outlier. It has an outlier that is much less than the majority of the data. It's not symmetrical. It is actually negatively skewed or left skewed. There's different shapes in the distribution. Notice these are all frequency histograms. Looking at letter C, we discussed the right skewed distribution. Here is the outlier, which is much greater than the majority of the data. It's causing this long right tail and causing the data to be right skewed, or again, positively skewed is another way of saying it. The opposite of right skew would be this one right here, figure D, where it has some values that are much less than the majority of the data, which exists right around here. This outlier to the left is causing this long left tail to occur or to appear, and it's causing this left skew. We can describe this data as a left skew. It can also be referred to as negatively skewed. We want this one right here. This is like the perfect one. This is the bell-shaped or normal distribution. Notice that the bell-shaped distribution has most of the data right here in the center. Okay, it's approximately symmetrical. It's not perfect, but it's approximately symmetrical. It has about the same amount of low values as it has high values, and there's a general curve. If we were going to kind of look at this like this, we'd see that there's a general curve. The other type of distribution that you may see is the uniform distribution, which is this one right here. Notice that the uniform distribution is symmetrical. It's the same on both sides, but the frequency remains the same throughout each one of the bins. Each one of these bins show that there are 20 values in each. So there are no differences in the uniform distribution. The next aspect that we want to look at is the center. What is the typical value? If you have a normal distribution, and you notice that this is normal, right? We have the most of the data is in the center. It's approximately symmetrical. It's not exactly symmetrical, but it's pretty close, right? This is the typical value. In this case, we have a bimodal distribution. We have a frequency of 10 that's very low, and we have a frequency of 10 that's very high. The center value is not typical. We have a lot of low and we have a lot of high, and the center value is not typical. This is not what we want, right? If we see something that looks bimodal, the center value is not the typical value. It's not appropriate to use for statistical testing. We also want to look to see how many mounds there are, or how many modes there are. A unimodal distribution like this one, here we have again something else. Here we have a frequency distribution that is approximately normal. We have the majority of the values here in the center, and they taper out so that slowly, as you go to the left of this, we see that there's very few low values, and there's also very few high values, and they sort of tend to increase as we get closer and closer to the center. A bimodal distribution has 2 mounds, and here's one with 2 mounds. You have a lot of values that are over here, and you have a lot of values that are over here. Notice the X, and maybe this should be an X bar. Here is the mean. There's a lot of values that are less than the mean, a lot of values that are low to the mean, but there's not a lot of values that are right at the mean. Another thing that you can get is multimodal distributions, where you just kind of get all these tall bars here that are showing a multimodal distribution. Now, as an aside, can these change depending on your bin width? They can. It's something to look at. For the purposes of this class, we don't really get into it. So like I said, our gold standard here is the normal distribution. We want something that has one mode. So notice it has one mode. It's symmetrical. Okay. And it's not skewed. There's nothing that's causing a very, very long tail or a very, very right tail. It's symmetrical. The reason why it's so important to check your data to see if you have a normal distribution is that the advantage is that we can apply theories of probability in order to make inferences about the population if we have a normal distribution. Because it's so important that we have a normal distribution to base any of our inferences, we have to make absolutely sure that we can assume that the distribution of our data is normal. And there's 2 ways to check it. You can check it visually, and you can check it numerically. We check it over and over again because we want to know with as much certainty as possible that the theories of probability will be applicable so that we can make inferences about our population. We've already talked a little bit about looking at the histogram visually. We looked at the different ways that the data, the shape of the data, the shape of the distribution can be symmetric or not symmetric. We look to see if it can have more than one mode or if it's unimodal, just one mode. And we look to see if it had like this overall bell-shaped curve. That's what we're looking for in the visual examination. The normal distribution will be symmetric. Okay, so it'll be the same on both sides. In this situation here, this tail is about the same length as this tail. It's unimodal. Most of the data is right in through here. We have one mound, so most of the data is in through here. And it's got an overall look of a bell-shaped curve. Okay, that's why the normal distribution is sometimes just called the bell curve. There's different ways you can check the data numerically, and you have to do all of them each time. The first way we're going to discuss is looking at the relationship between the mean and the median. When you're looking at those two values, the mean and the median, if those numbers are approximately the same, this is one indication that your distribution is normal. So here in the center diagram, and let me grab my pointer again, here in the center diagram, you see that this is a unimodal symmetrical curve. This is because the mean, the median, and the mode are all lined up right here in the center. Now, if you have a mean that is less than the median, like in this situation, notice here we have the mean. It is less than the median. Okay, the mean is highly affected by outliers. So that signifies that there is an outlier somewhere over here and it's pulling at the mean. It's pulling it closer to the outlier. The median is not affected by outliers, so it's going to sit still. And the mode is just showing the most frequent value, the value that we see most frequently. It's going to be here at the top, at the mound. Here, we're starting to see that because the mean is less than the median, it's starting to cause a left skew or a negative skew. The opposite is true in this situation. Here, we have a value that is significantly greater than the majority of the data. We have an outlier. This outlier is affecting the mean, and it is pulling the mean closer to that outlier. The outlier has no effect on the median or the mode, so these will stay about the same. So what does this mean? What does this signify is that this outlier is causing this positive skew or right skew, and the mean is being dragged along with it. So if you look at the two numbers, if the mean is less than the median, you're going to get a left skew, and if the mean is greater than the median, you're going to get a right skew. So you can just compare those two numbers and it'll give you some indication on whether you have a normal or a skewed distribution. Now, it's not the only thing that you need, because remember, the uniform distribution and the bimodal distribution also have this situation. The mean and the median are also in the center of those. So that's why you have to also look at it. That's why the visual component is so important. The other numerical examination we'd like to do is looking at this thing called a skewness value. And you don't have to calculate the skewness value. It's usually calculated using technology. The skewness value numerically describes that shift from left to right. Okay, the same thing as when we're looking at it, it gives a number that quantifies that shift. In order for a distribution to be considered normal, that skewness value has to be between -1 and +1. If you get a skewness value that is less than -1, then that distribution is excessively left skewed or negatively skewed. That number is saying that there's enough evidence here that this data is not sufficiently normal in order to be able to be used for statistical testing, right? At this point, theories of probability that go with the normal distribution are not applicable. You cannot use them. If you get a skewness value that's more than +1, then what it's telling you is that the distribution is excessively right skewed, or excessively positively skewed. Here, you would get a number that is greater than +1, and it's just as simple, and we're going to look at some output here in a second, but you're just going to look at a number and decide if that number is within the range, acceptable range of positive and -1, or if it's beyond that. The other number that we're going to look at is the kurtosis value, and that is also calculated using technology. The kurtosis value describes an up and down shift by the mode. So how, you can think of it as how pointed the mode is or how flattened the mode is. The acceptable range to assume normality for kurtosis is a number that exists between -3 and +3. Again, it's as easy as just looking at output to check the number to see if it is between the +3 and the -3. Now, what happens if you have a negative kurtosis? So here in the black is my normal distribution. If you can imagine this mound being flattened out, right? And as this area gets flattened out, the mode gets flattened out, the tails get thicker. See how the tail used to be only this thick and now it's very thick? Okay, it kind of got squashed. Well, negative numbers, if you think of the y-axis, numbers become more negative as they go down the y-axis. So what's happened here is this black curve got flattened out. More of the probability or the area under the curve spilled out into the tails and made the tails thick. This is called negative kurtosis or negatively kurtic. Another way of saying it is platykurtic. And the reason they call it platykurtic is, like, if you can think of like a platypus, how platypus has like a flat beak. I guess platy means like flat. So that's why they call it platykurtic. The opposite is true if you can think of this normal curve being pulled up towards the ceiling, right? Pulled up high. And instead of it having these kind of symmetrical tails that are about, I don't know, a little bit thicker, here the tails got very, very thin. See how much thinner this tail, let me grab my pointer again. See, this pink tail is a lot thinner when you look at the x-axis than the black tail when you look at the x-axis. There's just a little bit of space here where there's much more space here, right? And then it gets very, very tall in the center. The mode is very tall or pointed. This is an excessively positive kurtic or positively kurtic. This is also called leptokurtic. In all of these situations, there is no skewness. All of these curves are symmetrical. This darker red burgundy colored curve is symmetric. The black normal curve is symmetric. And the pink leptokurtic curve is symmetric. If you drew a line down the center, you would have approximately the same on both sides. However, the distribution is still not acceptable because you want this shape to exist so that, again, the distribution of the probability under the curve can be applied appropriately. So let's look at some statistical output, and let's look at first the relationship between the mean and the median. So here's the mean, 195.15, and the median is 180. Okay, so this is a good time to pause the video and think to yourself, which is less, the median or the mean? So if you're back, you probably saw that the mean is more than the median. What does that signify? It may signify that there's an outlier that is greater than the majority of the data. Pulling it towards a positive direction, we need to see if it's skewed enough. Okay, now let's look at the skewness. The skewness is positive. It's a positive 0.86. It's positive. It's still within the acceptable range because skewness can be between +1 and -1. So skewness works out pretty good. Okay, good. It's positive, but it's not so skewed. Basically, this is saying it's skewed. It's pretty skewed, but it's not so skewed you can't use the data. The last piece is that it's kurtosis, and the kurtosis is -0.417. Remember, kurtosis has a range of positive and -3. -0.417 is within that range. So it's slightly flattened, not a lot, not to the point where it's messing up the curve. According to the numerical output here, the mean is greater than the median. So we assume a positive skewness. It's verified by the skewness value of positive 0.86, but positive 0.86 is still within the acceptable range. And the kurtosis is -0.417, which is also within the acceptable range. So this, just by the statistical output, would look like this data is pretty good. Here is another piece of statistical output. Now this is a great chance again for you to pause the video and see if you can do this on your own. So this is go ahead and pause. And if you decided not to pause, or if you're back after pausing, let's do it together. So again, we're going to look to see what's the relationship between the mean and the median. Here the mean is 30.8 and the median is 23. So the mean is still greater than the median. This is suggesting a positive skew. Let's look at the skewness. Skewness is 0.6, positive 0.6. It's showing it's positive. And that is confirmed by what we saw here, but it's not sufficiently skewed for this to not be okay. Remember, the skewness value has to be within -1 and +1 for it to be appropriate, for it to be acceptable. This number, positive 0.6, is within that range, so it's acceptable. The last thing we're going to look at is kurtosis. The kurtosis says that it's -0.54. The acceptable range for kurtosis is -3 and +3, and this lies well within that range. This is saying that the distribution is just slightly squashed down. It's slightly platykurtic, slightly negatively kurtotic, and it's looking pretty good. So again, this one is okay. So what's the big idea? The big idea is that the shape of the distribution can be described visually and it can be described numerically. Descriptions of the histogram, as well as the numerical outputs, describe if the distribution of the data is normal or if it is not normal. For example, it's skewed or leptokurtic or platykurtic. The other big idea is that the distribution must be checked for normality. If we want to be able to use the theories of probability to answer questions about the population, the data must be normal. The only way to know if the data is normal is by checking for normality. This is called checking the assumption of normality. So that's it for today. With that said, don't forget to check your emails, check Blackboard, do your homework, and subscribe to this channel. Even better, hit that notification bell so you know when there are new videos for this course. Okay? This is your teacher, Taurus, saying stay safe, and I will be waiting to give you a virtual elbow bump in the next video. Ciao!